afternoon. I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we're adumbrating the second half of Myers Psychology, Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception.
So let's get started.
Here we go.
All right, let's start off at the very start with one of our first senses other than sight, which is the sense of touch. Touch is pretty simple the way it works in a biological sense. You have nerve endings at the end of your fingers and all along your body, and when those nerve endings are triggered by a stimulus, such as someone poking you,
Ouch.
the signal is sent back to your brain, which then decides what to do. One important vocab word is kinesthesis, which comes from the Latin kino, meaning motion. Am I right, Abe?
That is not true.
What is it, Abe?
That is not a Latin-derived word.
Is it Greek?
Yes.
Okay, close enough. But what kinesthesis is the sense of your body's position. So if you take your hand and put it under a table where you can't see your hand, you're still going to know roughly where your hand is. The vestibular sense is another key part of the touch sensation, and that's the ability of the inner ear to monitor your body's position and movement. So in our example of this guy doing a flip, he's only able to do that because his inner ear is telling his body exactly how to shape himself so that he lands that flip without breaking his neck like I would if I tried it, or Abe definitely would if he tried it.
Why isn't my inner ear as smart as his?
Well, it's because some people have trained more and they're simply better at doing things than other people. But let's move on, Abe.
Anyways, we can talk about pain now. The basic idea here is that your body informs you that something has gone wrong through pain, and thus pain helps you avoid injury. And the key idea to remember is that pain combines both top-down processes and bottom-up sensations.
So the gate control theory. It states that there are small nerve fibers located in the spinal cord that conduct pain signals. Thus, the spinal cord functions as this neurological gate in the sense that when you suffer injury, small fibers activate and allow the gate to be opened. This process leads to the feeling of pain. Finally, when the large fibers are activated in your spinal cord, pain signals are blocked and prevented from reaching the brain. So to summarize, small fiber cords open the gate and allow you to feel pain until the large fibers activate and close the gate.
Sounds good.
So here's a good diagram that shows how pain travels from the site of the activity in your tissue all the way into your spinal cord and then into your brain. There's another key idea, the idea that the brain can create pain, and it does this through phantom limb sensations. These sensations occur when the brain doesn't correctly interpret spontaneous activity in the central nervous system when there is no normal sensory input, so when you don't have a limb.
It is because of the brain's creations that 7 out of 10 amputees feel pain in non-existent limbs.
Yeesh.
Yeah, I know. This phenomenon extends to other senses. In fact, people with hearing loss experience tinnitus, or ringing in the ears, and those with vision loss have phantom sights, or these non-threatening hallucinations. So overall, the brain can create reactions without functioning senses, and thus we can feel, hear, taste, and smell, and see just with our brains.
Alright, here we go in the second part of pain. The key idea here is that pain is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. So we've already talked about the biology portion of pain. We've talked about the spinal cord activity. The psychology facet of pain is the fact that our brain edits memories of pain.
Our memories focus into 1, the peak moment of pain, and 2, the amount of pain experienced at the end. So here's an example. After a group of people dipped one hand into cold water for 60 seconds, then in another trial, dipped one hand in cold water for 60 seconds, followed by a somewhat less painful 30 seconds more, they were asked about which trial they found most painful. Surprisingly, most people preferred the second trial, even though it was longer and had more net pain. However, this second trial had less pain in the end, so it was remembered as being less painful.
Alright, and the final facet of pain is the social cultural aspect. The key idea here is that empathy increases our pain. When we see another person experiencing pain, or even we watch another person bending their own finger back, we get the shivers. We experience some sort of pain ourselves. Now, there are two main ways that we can control pain. We can use an inert placebo. And an example of this would be if a doctor injected a patient with what the doctor said is pain medication, but in reality, the medication didn't have any effect on the patient. Now, when this happened, many patients report that they experienced less pain after the medication, even though the medication wasn't really pain medicine. It's the placebo effect. You can also control pain through distractions. As you see in that picture in the top right corner of the slide, sometimes during amputations, patients enter this alternate reality so that they're transported to a different mental state, and thus they're distracted from the pain and they feel less pain.
Next, we'll move on to the sensation of taste, which is mostly defined by your tongue, and the fact that the tongue has over 200 taste buds, which are neuroreceptors which respond to chemicals. Taste, however, can be influenced by other things, much as pain could, including the placebo effect. In one experiment, adults were given wine which in reality cost $10, but which they were told cost $90. In that experiment, the adults found that the wine which they had been told costed more was much better tasting than the other $10 wine, despite the fact that the wines were the same. So taste, as well as pain, can fall victim to the placebo effect. But why do we have the sense of taste if it can fall victim to the placebo effect so easily? Well, it's because taste is useful in an evolutionary perspective. For example, our picture of a giraffe here, which, if you note, has a massive tongue with possibly thousands of taste buds. The point of the tongue and of taste in general is to be able to taste out foods which have more protein, more fiber, and know that those are the ones you should eat, as opposed to poisonous blackberries, which could end up killing you off entirely. However, there's other aspects which influence taste. Notably, when we look at these examples of very expensive truffles, our eyes and even our nose will tell us that these are disgusting foods that we should never eat. However, when we taste them, they'll actually taste quite good. And that's an example of sensory interaction, the idea that one sense can influence another. So the fact that the food looks disgusting and smells disgusting might make it taste worse, despite the fact that if a blind person who couldn't smell would eat those truffles, he would actually enjoy them tremendously.
On to smell we go. The key idea here is that smell is a chemical sense.
Molecules of some substance floating in the air reach a cluster of millions of receptor cells located in the top of our nasal cavities. These clusters of cells, called olfactory receptor cells, wave like sea anemones and alert the brain by bypassing the thalamus through their axon fibers.
So the other key idea is that the attractiveness of a smell derives from learned associations. For example, people in the US like the smell of wintergreen much more than people in Great Britain, since US citizens tend to identify wintergreen with candy and gum, while British citizens associate it more with medicine.
Alright, next let's move on to the concept of form perception, the idea of how we group things together when we look at them. The first key idea here is the figure ground theory, which states that we recognize certain objects as figures which stand out from the ground. So for example, when you're looking at the newspaper, you'll identify the words as the figures standing out from the white paper, which would be the ground. Another key idea here is that of grouping, and we group things together in a number of ways. First being proximity, things being close to each other. Next, similarity, continuity, closure, and common region. All of these are key ways that our mind and our brain groups things together when we think about them. And it makes it not only easier to remember stuff, but easier to identify certain stimulus.
So now on to depth perception. The idea here is that depth perception is partly innate, meaning that we're born with the ability to perceive depth. For example, when infants were placed on the edge of a visual cliff or a laboratory device used to test depth perception, most of them refused to crawl over the ledge even when their mothers were coaxing them. This proves that people are born with depth perception. Now, depth perception does increase with age. As we age older, our depth perception improves. In addition to binocular cues, there are also monocular cues, which differ from binocular cues since they are perceivable by either eye alone. For example, horizontal vertical illusion is a monocular cue that describes our tendency to perceive horizontal dimensions as shorter than identical vertical dimensions. This is why people tend to pour less juice into tall, thin glasses than they do into short, wider glasses.
Here's an example of retinal disparity. Hold your finger in front of your nose like this. Then oscillate between closing one eye and the other, like that. You'll notice that your finger seems to move when it's actually not moving. So this is an example of retinal disparity.
All right, now we're going to talk about motion perception, how your mind knows what's moving, if you're moving, and what's not moving. The main way that the mind knows that motion is occurring is based off size changes. So here we have a picture of 1920s gangster Al Capone. And let's say you met him down a dark alleyway. Well, clearly you'd want to run away, but so would he, because he has a $20,000 price on his head and he needs to scamper back to shelter. So he'll take off running down the other side of the alley, and when you look back next time, he's going to look a lot smaller. And that's how your mind will know that he's in the process of running away. He'll be getting smaller. An interesting side note here is the phi phenomenon, which is when something's not moving but appears to be in motion. We have the Apple loading symbol, which I see way too often when my MacBook runs out of power and I have to recharge it and power it back on. I get that symbol. The motion isn't really occurring. There's just lights blinking on and off. However, the mind assumes that that circle is really moving around in a spherical motion.
All right, now we're going to talk about perceptual constancy, and things can get a little confusing here. So perceptual constancy is the idea of perceiving objects as having consistent size, shape, and etc., even when retinal images change. So there are several examples of this. Shape constancy. We can look at the opening door phenomenon. Even as the door opens more and seems to look more trapezoidal in this image, we still perceive it as its original rectangular shape. We still can tell that the door is a rectangle. There's also size constancy, and that's the relationship between perceived distance and perceived size. So when we discern an object's distance, we gain insight on its size, and vice versa. When we're familiar with the general size of an object, in this case a human being seeming to step on other human beings, we can better judge its distance. So although it may initially look like there's a giant about to crush those humans, we know that human foot is simply closer to our view than those humans, and thus it just gives us the illusion of being about to crush those humans. Size constancy. Now, lightness constancy is this having the same lightness perceived even when the illumination varies. So there's this idea of relative luminance, and it just states that the amount of light an object reflects is relative to its surroundings. So look to the diagram. Relative luminescence thus means that squares A and B in the image are exactly the same color.
No way, Abe.
They just look different because of the shadow cast by the cylinder. If you don't believe me, Frank, you can look at the video that is linked in the description.
I will do that.
You will do that. And there's the final part of perceptual constancy is color constancy, and that's perceiving known objects as having a constant color, even though shifts in illumination change the wavelengths that the object reflects. And if you didn't know, color depends on how extended or compressed a wavelength is.
I see. So even if it's really dark and I'm eating an apple, I'll still think the apple's red.
Yes.
Now for an extremely short section, that about sensory deprivation and restored vision. This section essentially explains that humans are shape blind. For example, we have two wooden constructions featured here. One's obviously a block, another's obviously a sphere. If you gave both to a blind man, they could obviously feel the difference. One of them has corners, the other is completely round. However, if that same blind man had his blindness cured, he would not be able to identify which one is which. Even if for his entire life up to that point, he would have been able to feel the difference, when he first saw them, he could not tell you which one was the square and which one was the sphere. He just couldn't tell because humans are shape blind in regards to how we see things. We can't make that automatic connection with how we process the sense of touch.
All right, the long-awaited perceptual adaptation. This section is really simple. The key idea is that we can adapt to changed visual input. For example, a psychologist named George Stratton wore a device that inverted his view of the world for 8 days. In the beginning, the sky seemed to be at his feet and the ground seemed upwards. But after a few days, Stratton was able to walk without bumping into things, and he was able to reach and pick up objects he was searching for. Thus, after a change in Stratton's visual input, the world returned to normal after several days. So we can adapt to change visual input.
For example, when I put on ski goggles, everything looks orange to me. But after a few seconds, the colors return to normal because of color constancy, and everything begins to look as it did before.
Next, we're going to talk about perceptual sets, which are similar to perceptual adaptation, except that perceptual sets form as a result of what someone tells you, instead of wearing goggles that invert your vision. A key example here is the piece of toast. If someone didn't tell you that there was a picture of Jesus in the middle of it, you might never see it. But having been told that Jesus Christ is in the middle of that toast, you can't help but notice it. So a perceptual set is a predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. Another example is that helicopter, which looks like it's lifting up a small piece of military equipment. However, that small piece of military equipment is actually an American Chinook helicopter, one of the biggest that we make. An example of what a Chinook can lift is in this picture here, which explains that a Chinook is actually quite a large piece of equipment. It can lift up Humvees. But the perceptual set told you that it was simply a regular-sized helicopter lifting up a smaller piece of equipment. Alright, Abe, what's this one about?
Extrasensory perception and claims of ESP. So ESP and parapsychology both deal with perception occurring apart from sensory input. And there are 3 types of ESP: telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. We're going to look to Star Wars to explain this.
So the Jedi's link with the Force is also a reference to ESP. In the chronologically 4th episode of Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi demonstrates his powers of telepathy, or mind-to-mind communication, in the fact that after he dies, he's able to communicate with Luke Skywalker through his thoughts. In fact, Obi-Wan uses telepathy to give Skywalker confidence in using the Force to destroy the Death Star. Skywalker hears Obi-Wan's voice in his head and is thus able to aim his bomb correctly. Jedis also had powers of clairvoyance, or the ability to sense events that have occurred without seeing or hearing about them. For example, when Darth Sidious executed Order 66 in the chronologically 3rd episode of Star Wars, Yoda claimed he felt a disturbance in the Force. Yoda could sense the deaths of his fellow Jedi. Finally, Jedis have powers of precognition, or seeing into the future. The Jedi Council originally refused to train Anakin Skywalker in the chronologically 1st episode of Star Wars because the Council could see that Anakin Skywalker's future was muddled.
So the basic idea here is that psychics are full of baloney. They have almost never successfully predicted any of the year's headline occurrences. But the idea here is that the improbable becomes the inevitable, and that's how psychics confuse people into thinking that they actually are psychic. For example, everybody imagines countless events throughout each day, so some surprising coincidences are bound to occur. In fact, studies estimate that more than 1,000 times each day, one person will think of another person and then learn of this other person's death within 5 minutes of their thought. So in this way, the improbable becomes the inevitable, and some people believe that psychics truly are psychic.
So as Abe was just expounding upon, psychics are full of malarkey. None of their claims have ever been backed up when it comes to empirical testing, which we explained in the very first chapter. The hypothesis of ESP, telepathy, these things is that you can know things before they happen or send thoughts to someone else. But in every experiment which has tested this in an experimental condition, it has never been proved to be true. If you can ever find a way to prove that you're psychic or someone you know is psychic, there's a $1 million prize for doing so.
Please comment down below.
Until then, we'll catch you guys next time.